Roland Waters sat in a bar, sipping rum as he waited for a message to come through on his phone. Taking another sip, he reflected on the events that had led him to this moment in his life. Born 36 years ago in Anchorage, Alaska, he had married Linda, his high school sweetheart, right after graduation. He took a job on the Trans-Alaska Pipeline, spending weeks traveling between Prudhoe Bay and Valdez, handling various issues as they arose. One day, after a grueling 6-week trip, he returned home only to find Linda in bed, not with one, but two former classmates. She tried to brush it off, claiming it was meaningless, but Roland had heard enough. He divorced her and joined the army, hoping to leave it all behind. Eventually, while stationed at Fort Bliss, Texas, he met and married Melissa. Roland thought he'd hit the jackpot this time, but after returning from a 12-month deployment in Iraq, he discovered she was involved with another soldier on base. They divorced, and that marriage lasted just under 2 years, about the same as his first with Linda. Determined to focus solely on his career, he threw himself into his work, becoming the best soldier he could be. His sole mission became eliminating the enemy, and he became damn good at it. After his military service, Roland was hired as a freelance operative, working on various assignments across regions like Africa and the Middle East. He also spent time in Myanmar, assisting an ethnic minority in its resistance against a harsh regime. In short, he became a soldier of fortune, a high-paid and highly sought-after mercenary. His ruthlessness, efficiency, and resilience made him popular among potential clients. One of the things that set Roland apart from other contractors was his careful selection of clients. He refused to work for those involved in drugs or human trafficking. On occasion, he even took lower-paying jobs if he believed in the cause of his employer. Another unique aspect of Roland's approach was his choice of weapon. While others opted for modern gear, he wielded an old Thompson submachine gun from World War II, purchased from a dubious source who claimed it had once been used by another mercenary during the Congo conflicts in the 1960s. Legend has it that Patty Hearst once owned this gun. After hearing about it, the man had boasted. Roland dismissed that as nonsense. Still, the weapon seemed to call to him, feeling right in his hands as if they were made for each other. It was in excellent condition, equipped with 2 large magazines and a drum holding 100 rounds of .45 caliber ammunition. Although it had an effective range of only about 150 meters, the trench broom, as it was known, was deadly up close and suited him perfectly. He particularly appreciated that it could be fired from the hip. Sure, it had cost him a considerable amount, but it was a formidable weapon at close range and incredibly reliable. After 10 years working as a mercenary, Roland grew tired of constant battles and returned home, hoping to leave the past behind and start a family. He became a freelance consultant for a private security company and began to settle down. He met his current wife, Susan, at a social event where he was hired to manage security. Susan was an attorney at Freeman and Douglas. They literally bumped into each other as she was heading toward the bar. He caught her as she stumbled, preventing her from falling to the hard floor. At the time, he thought little of it, but Susan was immediately struck by the tall, quiet, well-built man with a rugged scar on his face. They talked extensively that night and began dating shortly after. Roland was cautious not to reveal too much about his past, only telling her that he had worked abroad as a contractor following 4 years in the army. When she asked about the scars covering his body, he became particularly inventive with his explanations. He certainly never mentioned his secret overseas accounts. Having been burned twice before, he wasn't about to go through that again. They fell in love and married a year after their first meeting, and Roland thought he had finally found his one true soulmate. At first, things between them were good. They enjoyed each other's company several times a week and got along well. Naturally, they had their differences, like any married couple, but they managed to work through them. They even started talking about having children and bought a 2-story, 3-bedroom house in a nice suburban neighborhood. Then things began to go awry. Susan started spending more time at the office, working on various cases and going out with the girls and other colleagues. This made Roland uneasy, but the turning point came at her firm's summer party. As usual, he went with Susan, but he knew there'd be trouble the moment he walked in. Susan introduced him to her colleagues, as always, but then she introduced him to the firm's new attorney, Michael Van Owen. For a moment, Roland felt a jolt of déjà vu. He hoped it wasn't the same Van Owen he knew from Africa. But when he looked at the tall man with the chiseled face, his hopes faded. This was indeed the same man, the one who had once recruited him, fought alongside him, but then defected after a better offer supposedly came from a federal agency. That had been several years ago, but Roland wasn't the forgiving type, and he never forgot a face. Now, he found himself face to face with the man who had once tried to kill him. Van Owen extended his hand with a smirk, but Roland simply walked away. Susan ran after him, calling his name. "Roland, honey," she said. "What happened? Why were you so rude to Michael?" Roland couldn't explain everything to Susan without revealing his true past. "I don't trust that man," he replied. "Something about him unsettles me. I'm sorry, I just can't explain." "Well, you'll just have to get over it," she said. "Mike and I are working on several projects together, so we'll be spending a lot of time together. Now, pull yourself together and join us at the table." "You're working together?" Roland asked. Susan nodded. "Yes, together," she said. "Come on, we need to get back to the party." Susan took his hand and led him back to their table. He held her back for a moment. "Listen, Susan, you need to be more careful around him," he said. "Don't worry," she replied. "I'll be careful. Now come on, you're making me feel awkward." He allowed her to lead him back to the table, where they both sat down. Van Owen took a seat across from them, studying Roland closely. Roland thought to himself that maybe Van Owen was worried about being exposed. Susan walked over to another table to speak with some of her colleagues, and Van Owen leaned across the table, locking eyes with Roland. "I hope you understand that what happened in Africa wasn't personal," he said. "It was just business. But now that I know Susan is your wife, it's become personal. Know this, I intend to do everything I can to take her from you." "I should have tracked you down like a dog and taken you out back in Africa," Roland replied. "And I'm officially warning you, if you go after my wife, I will make sure you regret it." Van Owen laughed. "You're just as hopelessly romantic as ever, Roland," he said. "You always were. I've already gotten close to your wife, and I intend to push things further right in front of you, just to end this. And then I'll close out that contract. I bet she doesn't know anything about your past, does she? Who knows, maybe I'll fill her in. But let's call a truce for tonight, for old time's sake." "I'm warning you, Van Owen," Roland said. "This will end badly for you. Leave it alone. Don't drag Susan into this." Van Owen smiled, but it was far from friendly. Susan returned to their table and looked at the two men. "I see you two know each other," she said. "Yes, we certainly know where we stand, don't we, Roland?" Van Owen replied. "Yes," Roland answered in a neutral tone. Susan glanced between them, wondering what was happening between the two men. She also wondered if Mike had told Roland about their relationship. She knew Roland would never tolerate betrayal, especially after what he'd been through with his previous wives. She sat down next to him, and the three of them ate together, with Roland and Van Owen watching each other intently the whole time. Susan felt like she could cut the tension between them with a knife. After the meal and the usual speeches, Susan took Roland by the hand and led him to the dance floor. He held her tightly, feeling her body close to his. Normally, he enjoyed her nearness, but not tonight. As they danced, he kept a watchful eye on Van Owen, who was also watching them. "What's going on, Roland?" she asked quietly. "You're tense, like a coiled spring. Talk to me." "How well do you know Van Owen?" he asked. We work together on some projects. Why do you ask? She responded. You didn't answer my question, he said. How well do you know him? What do you mean? She asked. You know what I mean, he said. Were you involved with him? She looked at him, stunned. Of course not, she said. How could you even ask that? Let me rephrase the question, he replied. Have you been intimate with him? Her body tensed slightly at his question, giving him her answer. I see, he said. How long has this been going on? Roland, it means nothing, she said. It means everything to me, Susan, he replied. You know what I've been through, and you know how I feel about infidelity. I won't tolerate it. So tell me, dear wife, what do you really know about your lover? Not much, she admitted. Roland noted that she wasn't denying the affair. He joined our firm about 6 months ago. He supposedly worked on contract with a federal agency. So what? He's dangerous, Roland said. And if you want any future with me, you'd better end things with him as soon as possible. She looked at him, trying to read his thoughts. Is that a threat? She asked. It's not a threat, he replied. It's a warning. And you'd better take it seriously. Otherwise, this will end badly. What do you mean? She asked. Just trust me, he said. This will end badly. For you, for him, and for us. You're scaring me, Roland, she said. You should be scared, he replied. What aren't you telling me, Roland? What's going on? She asked. I can't tell you, Roland replied. You'll just have to trust me. How long has this been going on between you two? Not long, she said, a tear rolling down her cheek. Maybe a couple of months. A couple of months, Roland repeated. I see. Do you love him? No, she said. I love only you. You have a strange way of showing it, he replied. I'm so sorry, she said. I never wanted to hurt you. It was one of those things. I felt an attraction, and it just happened. That's nonsense, Roland said calmly, making her flinch. You could have said no, but you didn't. Please, believe me, she said. I truly love you, and I don't want to lose you. All right, Roland said. Then you shouldn't have any problem ending it. Why don't you tell him to leave you alone, right here and now, in front of me? All right, she said. If that's what I have to do. Let's go tell him right now, Roland said. If that's what you want, she replied nervously. They left the dance floor and walked back to their table. Van Owen stood there, watching them approach. My wife has something to say to you, Van Owen, Roland said. Mike looked at Susan, who seemed frightened. Mike, he knows. We can't see each other anymore, she said. I'm a married woman, and I want to stay that way. Van Owen nodded. I see, he said, glancing at Roland. Well, I suppose the stronger man wins again, he added, extending his hand. No hard feelings. Roland looked at Mike's outstretched hand with a stern expression. Refusing to shake it, he took Susan and led her toward the exit. Are we leaving already? She asked. Yes, he said. When they reached their car, Roland surprised Susan by inspecting it before getting inside. He even opened the trunk and the hood, checking for wires or anything suspicious. Satisfied that the car was safe, he helped Susan in and got behind the wheel himself. What was that about? Susan asked. You can never be too careful, he replied. They drove home in silence. Roland was furious, while Susan was nervous, unsure what her husband was planning. She hoped her statement at the party had convinced him enough to let go of her affair, but she still had lingering fears. Looking over at her husband, she suddenly didn't recognize him. It was like staring into the face of death itself. Are we all right? She asked, dreading his response. That depends on you, he replied. As long as you stay away from Van Owen, yes. In fact, I think you should look for another job. I can't do that, she said. I'm working on some very important projects right now, and if things go well, I might make partner at the firm. Roland looked at her. So, you're telling me your job is more important than our marriage? He asked. No, she replied. It's just that I'm at a critical point in my career, and I can't afford to mess this up right now. You've already damaged our marriage. My gut tells me I should make you pay for this, he said. And I still might. If I find out you're involved with Van Owen again, it's over. Understood? She nodded. I understand, she said. But you need to tell me what's really going on between you two. I already told you, I can't disclose that, he replied. Let's just say we have a history, and leave it at that, all right? Susan nodded but decided she'd confront Mike on her own. At that moment, Roland resolved to try to work things out with Susan, but it would be a trust, but verify situation. At the first opportunity, he contacted an old friend who specialized in surveillance. Bill Matthews had had some run-ins with the law in his youth, but those who knew him simply said he was a spirited kid. Bill wasn't as skilled with firearms as others on his team, but he was the best scout and observer Roland had ever met. He also had a keen tactical mind, able to assess a situation in seconds. Roland often said he trusted Bill's instincts more than others' so-called facts. What? Van Owen's alive? Bill asked. Are you sure? Oh, I'm sure, Roland replied. And he's been involved with my wife. That son of a gun, Bill said. What do you need from me? Whatever it is, I'm in. Right now, I need surveillance, audio, video, tracking, Roland said. How much will you charge me for this? Hey, I owe you my life a few times over, Bill said. Consider it a favor. Thank you, Roland said. I appreciate it, but at least let me cover the expenses. Just buy me a beer when this is all over, all right? Bill replied. Roland smiled. Consider it done, my friend, he said. So, what are you planning to do if they're still, involved? Bill asked. We'll cross that bridge when we get there, Roland replied. It didn't take long for Roland to get the evidence he needed. A week after his conversation with Bill, he held a large manila envelope with photos and a USB drive containing high-definition videos. That Friday, he sat at the kitchen table with the envelope, waiting for his wife to come home. His .45 caliber pistol lay on the table as well. It was 6:30 p.m. when she opened the door and walked inside. She made her way to the kitchen and saw her husband sitting at the table with the envelope and the gun in front of him. Instinctively, she knew she'd been caught. Sit down, my wife, Roland said in a neutral tone. She remained standing. I said, sit down, he thundered. She obediently pulled out a chair and Saturday. So, you caught me, she said. Roland nodded slowly. Do I need to show you the photos? He asked. How about the video? Her eyes widened. You have video? She asked. Yes, Roland replied. In high definition. I have to say, you could have made it in adult films. Do you know what was worse than watching you with that piece of trash? No, Roland, I don't, she said quietly. Hearing the two of you mock me, he said. Susan lowered her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. Stop crying, he said. You made me a promise, and then you broke it. How could you do this to us? Was I that terrible a husband to you? Did I ever mistreat or disrespect you? No, you were a wonderful husband, she replied. Then why did you do it? Was it his charm? Are you just someone who couldn't resist temptation? He asked. No, she said. I guess I just fell in love with him. I suppose you'll be asking for a divorce now. Is that what you think? He asked rhetorically. She looked at him defiantly. Just know, she said, it would be the biggest mistake you could make. Now I know everything about you. What did they call you? Ah, yes, Roland the Heartless Thompson Gunner. How many did you kill during your career as a mercenary? You know what will happen in a divorce. After all, I also know you're wanted in several countries. Roland smirked. If this foolish woman knew that much, he thought, she should also know how thoroughly he dealt with his enemies. She had no idea what she was meddling with. First of all, that nickname came from an old song from the 70s. And it was headless, not heartless. As you can see, my head is still very much attached to my body, and I'm from Alaska, not Norway, he said. Secondly, I haven't done anything illegal. At least, not in the US. And those other governments have changed since I was last there, plus we don't have extradition treaties with them. Well, I'm sure the IRS would be very interested in your offshore accounts, she replied. You know, the ones holding all that untaxed money. Roland smiled again. If you'd taken the time to check, you'd know those old accounts were set up by your lover a long time ago, Roland said. And right now, they're empty. They've been that way for years. Her face paled as he continued, that's right. Your lover is the one who first recruited me into the business. Oh, he didn't tell you that, did he? I bet he also didn't mention that he was right there with me, knee-deep in blood for years. And I bet he didn't tell you about the contract he was given to kill me. What? She asked. That can't be true. Oh, but it is, dear wife, Roland said. He came very close to killing me. I stopped him and nearly took him down, but he escaped. I hadn't seen or heard from him again until the party. Imagine my surprise, seeing him there. I don't believe you, she said. Didn't you see the scar on the inside of his thigh? You must have noticed it, Roland said. I saw you looking at him when he was with you. Susan's face turned even paler. I left him that scar when I shot at him. I aimed lower, but he moved just in time. It was only a flesh wound, but I bet it hurt. Did he tell you he was planning to finish the job? Susan shook her head. No, she said. That can't be true. Oh, but it is, dear wife, Roland said. And I know what he told you because I have it all on video. I also have your response. Would you like to watch it? She shook her head. So, what are you planning to do? Are you still going on your little getaway with him? You know, the one you two were planning this weekend, while telling me it was for a business trip out of town. So you know about that? She asked. Actually, yes, Roland said. I've known for a while. I even took the liberty of packing your bag. How did you find out? She asked. That doesn't matter. What matters is that I know, he replied. That he didn't tell her that Bill would be on the cruise to keep him informed of their actions. Mike is coming to pick me up tonight, she said. Roland shook his head. I don't think so, he said. In fact, if that guy shows up here, I'll take both of you out on the spot and make it look like self-defense. You'd better call him right now and make other arrangements. You wouldn't dare, she hissed. Roland raised the gun. Do you really want to test me? He asked. Susan recoiled in shock. I didn't think so. Call your lover. Right now. He cocked the gun to make his point. Susan pulled out her phone and dialed the number. Put it on speaker, Roland commanded. She complied, and soon they both heard Mike answer. Hey, baby, he said. Are you ready for me to come pick you up? No, darling, she said. I'll come to you, and we'll head out from there. Come on, he replied. We had this planned. No, sweetheart, Roland growled. She'll come to you, and I never want to see either of you again. If you set foot in my house, I swear I'll blow your damn brains out. He means it, Susan said nervously. Yes, I do, Roland added. All right, Mike replied. Calm down. I'll stay here. Just promise me you won't hurt her. I won't harm her as long as she leaves right now, and neither of you ever crosses my path again, Roland said. He looked at his soon-to-be ex-wife. Call me when you get to him, and call me again when you reach the airport. I want to know where you are at all times. He returned to the phone. And if you deceive me again, Van Owen, I promise I won't miss. Got it? Got it, Roland, Mike replied. Roland took the phone from Susan and ended the call. He handed the phone back to her and nodded toward the door. Get out, he said to Susan. Susan took a step toward him, reaching for his face. Roland stepped back. Stay away from me, he said coldly. She recoiled at his words and tone. You've lost the right to touch or kiss me. Just grab your things and leave. She walked toward her luggage and looked back at her husband once more. I'm so sorry, Roland, she said. Yeah, sure, he replied sarcastically. By the way, you should know that once Van Owen is done with you, he'll deceive you, just like he's done to others. And trust me, he won't hesitate to hurt you if it suits him. I'm not saying he will, just giving you a heads up on the kind of person you're dealing with. Just know that I won't be here to pick up the pieces when he leaves you. Tears streamed down her cheeks. Don't you love me anymore? She asked. That he shook his head. No, he said. I did once. I even gave you a second chance, something I rarely do. But you chose to betray me. I don't deal with traitors, and that's what you are. Now, go. She nodded and slowly walked out the door. Half an hour later, she called to let him know she was at Van Owen's apartment. Another 30 minutes later, she called to say they were at the airport. Goodbye, wife, he said. Enjoy what's left of your worthless life. What does that mean? She asked. You know the old saying about lying down with dogs, he replied. Just remember what I told you. The phrase likely refers to, he who lies down with dogs rises with fleas. He ended the call and dialed Bill's number. They're at the airport, he said when Bill answered. Got it, Bill replied. I'll stay in touch. The next day, Roland received regular updates about Van Owen and his wife. It seemed they were having a honeymoon of sorts on the cruise. On the second day, Roland went to a local bar, watching a game on the big TV with little enthusiasm while nursing his drink. A few people, including the bartender, tried to engage him in conversation, but he made it clear he wasn't interested, and they soon left him alone. About an hour later, his phone rang. He glanced at the caller ID and saw it was Bill. He picked up and spoke to his friend. What's going on? Boss, your wife's in danger, Bill said. Damn, Roland thought. What's the situation? He asked. Just as you predicted. I overheard Van Owen talking with some guerrillas, Bill replied. He's taking her to an island, and I'm following them on another boat. He intends to hand her over to them. Where are they heading? Roland asked. Boss, there are around 700 islands in the Bahamas. But Van Owen let some details slip during his conversation with them. When is this handoff supposed to happen? Roland asked. From what I overheard, about 12 hours from now, Bill said. You have just enough time to get here if you want to stop this. Roland despised what his wife had done, but he couldn't live with himself if he allowed her to fall into this situation or worse. There was no choice. Van Owen would have to die. He'd deal with Susan's betrayal later. Send me the coordinates and find transportation, Roland said. Already done, boss, Bill replied. Details are on the way. Roland smiled. This was one of the things he valued about Bill. He was not only loyal but also a step ahead in planning. Thanks, Bill, Roland said. See you soon. I'll be here, Bill replied. Ending the call, Roland put away his phone, paid his bill, and headed home. Once there, he went to the attic where he kept his gear. He unlocked a large chest and opened it. There it was, his Thompson, oiled and ready. He picked it up and inspected it. Everything was still clean, well-oiled, and in good condition. He took a loaded drum magazine and an extended magazine, deciding that 130 rounds should be enough. If not, he trusted he could find more weaponry if needed. Grabbing the rest of his equipment, he suited up for the job. Once ready, he drove to a small airstrip where he knew a Learjet was waiting for him. He spoke briefly with the pilot, gave him the coordinates Bill had sent along with an envelope of cash. Within minutes, the plane was in the air. Roland reviewed the map Bill had provided and planned his approach. Although the island was mostly uninhabited, it had a landing strip, often used by smugglers and guerrillas. He carefully studied the map, visualizing his next steps. In the lavatory, he finished applying camouflage paint and donned his combat gear. Before leaving, he looked at himself in the mirror, mentally preparing for the bloody task ahead. He double-checked his equipment and left the lavatory. A while later, he peered into the darkness and spotted the island below. Looking closer, he could see what looked like a campfire. The plane began its descent and landed on the dirt strip. Once the plane stopped, he opened the door. The pilot glanced back at his passenger, and Roland returned his gaze. "Wait for my signal," Roland said to the pilot, who nodded in response. Roland stepped out of the plane and saw Bill running toward him. "This way," Bill said, leading Roland back the way he had come. "We won't miss it, Van Owen's got a good fire going." "I saw it," Roland replied quietly. "Stupid idiot. I could see it from 20 miles away." They moved stealthily through the vegetation, mainly to keep the drum magazine from rattling too loudly, and within 10 minutes they reached the edge of the camp. Roland and Bill dropped to their knees to survey the scene. Susan lay tied to the ground, arms and legs spread wide. In addition to Van Owen, Roland spotted 3 guerrilla fighters. Susan was crying and pleading for release. "Please, Mike," she cried. "Don't do this. Don't I mean anything to you?" He laughed. "Oh, sure," he said. "Right now, you're worth about $250,000 to me," he added, holding up a stack of folded cash. "As soon as the boss arrives, we'll make the trade, you for the rest of my payment, and you can start your new life. And your pathetic, clueless husband can't do a thing about it." The 3 guerrillas laughed in response. One of them stood over Susan and began unzipping his pants. "Put that away," Van Owen snapped. "El Capitan wants her unharmed. You know that." The frustrated guerrilla zipped his pants back up. Roland glanced at Bill, who held a .45 caliber pistol, then checked his watch. It was time to move. He motioned to Bill, and the 2 of them advanced quietly. They approached the camp just as Van Owen and the guerrillas gathered around the fire. Roland gestured for Bill to stay back and cover him. Bill obeyed without question as Roland slowly entered the camp. The men heard Roland switch his weapon to automatic mode, a process that required turning 2 levers, one to take it off safe and the other to set it to full auto. Without saying a word, he pulled back the charging handle, and before the guerrillas could react, he fired several controlled bursts from the hip, knocking them back. A couple of guerrillas managed to get off a few shots, but their aim was wild and from a distance. After taking down the guerrillas, Roland raised his weapon to his shoulder, carefully aimed, and shot Van Owen in the head with a precise 3-round burst, ending him instantly. The entire encounter took only a few seconds. Roland looked around to ensure the area was secure. Then he noticed Susan. One of the stray shots from the guerrillas had struck her in the side. Bill knelt beside her as Roland looked on. She looked up at Roland with sad eyes. I'm sorry," she whispered hoarsely. Soon her eyes dimmed. Roland had seen enough death to know she was gone. Bill checked her pulse and looked up at him. "She's dead, boss," he said. "Should we take her with us?" Roland gathered his thoughts for a moment, then shook his head. "No," Roland replied. "El Capitan was expecting a blonde. I think he should get what he paid for, don't you?" "Man, you're cold, boss," Bill said. Roland smirked. "You know it, old friend," he said. "Let's bring her over to the fire. She wanted to be with Van Owen, now she can burn with him. Forever." They dragged her lifeless body to the fire, and Roland used bundles of cash to fuel the flames, handing a stack to Bill. "Consider this a bonus," he said as Bill pocketed the money. They placed Susan's body on the growing blaze, followed by Van Owen and the 3 dead gorillas. "Help me," Roland said. "No point in leaving too much evidence." After collecting their spent .45 caliber casings, they headed back to the plane. The pilot was waiting and took off as soon as they were on board. Bill watched his old friend as the plane returned to the States. Roland sat in the back, gazing out the window, drinking a beer, and smoking a rather expensive cigar. Bill had seen this many times before and knew better than to interrupt, at least, not until the first round of beer was finished. "Mind if I join you?" Bill asked as Roland opened a second beer. Roland handed him a beer and a cigar, motioning for him to sit down. "We've been through a lot, haven't we?" Bill said. Roland nodded, looking out the window. "You know, I really regret how all this turned out." "I know, Bill," Roland finally replied. "I warned her. I told her this would happen. She just didn't listen." "Thinking about getting back in the business?" "No," Roland said. "I'm getting too old for this stuff. Too sentimental." "Sentimental?" Bill asked. "You. Sentimental. That's the joke of the year." Roland smirked. "Yeah," he said. "Did you notice I didn't take anyone's head?" "I noticed that," Bill replied. Roland had been known for beheading his defeated enemies to instill fear in anyone who might challenge him. "I couldn't do it," Roland said. "Even after all she did, I just couldn't bring myself to do it." Bill nodded in understanding. "I get it, boss," Bill said. "I remember a time when you would have skinned her alive and played with her bones like toys. Whatever you decide to do, you know I'll always have your back." Roland looked at him and raised his beer. Bill returned the gesture, clinking his beer with Roland's. "I know, Bill," Roland said. "You've always been there for me. We're the last ones left from our team. You know that, right?" "Yeah, boss, I know," Bill replied. "Someone's got to survive," Roland said. "Someone's got to be around to tell the story. You're not planning to do what I think, are you?" Bill asked. "Please, don't." Roland shook his head. "No," Roland said. "Besides, you know that old mercenaries like us never die." "Yeah," Bill replied. "They just go to hell to regroup." Roland laughed and took another sip of his beer. "Exactly," he said, pausing for a moment. "You know, we'll need to play this right over the next few weeks." "Yeah," Bill agreed. "People are going to want to know what the hell happened." "But we don't know a thing, do we?" Roland asked. "Not a damn thing," Bill said. "I'll make sure the pilot understands that too." Roland nodded. It was amazing how much silence could be bought with money, along with the implicit threat of a bullet to the back of the head. Once the plane landed, Roland handed the pilot another envelope of cash, and Bill stayed behind to ensure the pilot's permanent silence. Roland drove home, cleaned up, and stowed his gear, hoping he'd never have to use it again. Exhausted, he finally fell asleep in the bed he once shared with Susan. Roland continued his routine as usual, distancing himself from anything related to Susan. When word came from the ship that she hadn't returned on board, he filed a missing person report and cooperated with officers who eventually questioned him. They accepted his account and left, wishing him luck. The firm where both Susan and Van Owen had worked also questioned him about their absence. He spoke with them, even hinting that they surely knew about her affair with Van Owen, right? He patiently waited, and a year after Susan had taken that ill-fated cruise, he filed for divorce on grounds of abandonment. 60 days later, the divorce was finalized, and Roland was officially free. Still feeling bitterness over her betrayal, Roland chose not to pursue any serious relationships with other women. Life went on uneventfully for Roland until a week before Christmas, when he heard a knock at the door. He looked through the peephole and saw 2 men in dark suits and sunglasses. "Feds," he thought. He opened the door, and one of them pulled out a set of documents. "Roland Waters?" the man asked. "Who's asking?" Roland replied, "Special Agent Smith," he said. "And this is Agent Jones. FBI. May we come in to talk for a bit?" "Sure," Roland said, letting the two men inside. As they entered, they glanced around. "Please, have a seat," Roland added. "Can I get you something to drink?" "No need, thank you," Smith replied, sitting in Roland's favorite chair. "What can I do for you, gentlemen?" Roland asked, "Have you ever been to the Bahamas?" Smith asked. Roland shook his head. "No," he said. "Why do you ask?" "What about your wife?" Smith asked. "Ex-wife," Roland corrected. "She left me over a year ago with her lover, and I have no idea where they went." "That would be Michael Van Owen?" Smith asked. "Yes," Roland replied. "We received a report from Bahamian authorities. They found remains on one of their islands, identified as your ex-wife and Mr. Van Owen," Smith said. "Oh. Is that so?" Roland asked. "Yes," Smith said. "You wouldn't know anything about that, would you, Mr. Waters?" Roland shook his head. "No," he replied. "Nothing at all. Just closing a few cases, that's all," Smith continued. "Van Owen had been on our radar for a while. Then he suddenly disappeared. It seems he was involved in human trafficking, while posing as an upstanding citizen. From what we could gather, it appears he might have had, well, a disagreement with one of his business associates." "A disagreement?" Roland asked. "What kind of disagreement? And what does this have to do with Susan?" "Please, Mr. Waters," Smith said. "Don't insult our intelligence. We know all about you. You're something of a legend in certain parts of the world with that Thompson of yours. Personally, I can't imagine why anyone would carry around such a loud, old relic, but to each his own, I suppose. You don't think I had anything to do with what happened to Susan, do you?" Roland asked. "No," Smith replied. "Your ex-wife was shot with a rifle, not a .45. There were 4 other bodies found as well, including Van Owen, and they all appeared to have been shot with a .45. But that's a fairly common caliber, and we're quite sure it wasn't you." "And why's that?" Roland asked. "None of the victims were beheaded," Smith replied. "Got it," Roland said. "We just wanted to make sure you hadn't decided to get back in the business," Smith added. "That's the case, right?" "No, I'm not returning to that line of work," Roland replied. "I'm getting too old to be wandering around jungles." Smith nodded. "Good," he said. "Because I wouldn't enjoy having to arrest you." "Yeah, neither would I," Roland replied. Smith and Jones stood up and shook Roland's hand. "That's all we have for now," Smith said. "If you hear anything, give me a call," he added, handing Roland a card. "Will do," Roland said. Smith nodded. "Merry Christmas, Mr. Waters," he said as they left. Roland thought about calling Bill, but his friend beat him to it. "Hey, boss," Bill said. "I wanted to give you a heads up." "I know," Roland replied. "They just left here." "They spoke to me too," Bill said. "I didn't tell them a thing. They said they were just tying up loose ends." "Same here," Roland said. "Hey, how about we grab a beer?" Bill agreed, and the two men met at a local bar that night. As their beers were set on the table, the jukebox began playing a song. Roland was a warrior from the land of the midnight sun, with a Thompson gun in his hand. "Merry Christmas," Roland said as the song he loathed played in the background. "Merry Christmas, boss," Bill replied, raising his beer. Roland glanced around the bar, wondering who had played the song. In the corner, he noticed 2 men in dark suits. One of them smirked and raised his beer toward him. "Agent Smith." Roland returned the gesture, lifting his middle finger with one hand while raising his beer with the other. Smith chuckled and took a sip. After finishing their beers, Smith and Jones approached Roland's table. Well, Smith said. "The last 2 surviving members of Strike Force Charlie having a beer together. That's what you used to call yourselves, right?" he asked. "Just 2 old friends sharing a drink," Roland replied. Nothing illegal about that, is there? It's Christmas, after all. Of course not, Smith said that he pulled up a chair and sat down next to Roland. He pointed to a very attractive waitress in a short skirt. You know, she's been eyeing you too since you walked in. Oh yeah? Roland asked. Maybe it's because of this, he added, gesturing to the scar on his face. No, I don't think that's it, Smith said. What do you think? He asked, looking at Jones. Jones shook his head. No, definitely not, Jones replied. Smith turned back to Roland. No, she likes you, he said. I'm a federal agent. You know, I can tell these things. Maybe if you play your cards right, you could take her out tonight. Roland looked at him. It's all good. We checked her out. Her name's Maria. She's single. And she's not working for the Russians. Jones smirked. Roland caught the hint. You're just a comedian, aren't you? Maybe she works for you, Roland replied. Smith shook his head. Nope, he said. Too easy. Trust me, she's interested in you. And the best part? You won't need lawyers, weapons, or money to spend time with her. He grinned, stood up, and patted Roland on the shoulder. Take care of yourself, Roland. And Merry freaking Christmas. Roland laughed. Merry Christmas to you, too, he said. And to you, Jones. Thanks, Jones replied, and they left the bar. Roland and Bill watched the two agents walk out. Interesting, Bill said. What do you think? Roland shrugged. Just two friends having a beer, he said. His gaze shifted to the pretty young waitress. As he watched, she glanced his way a few times, smiling. Well, to answer the question, I should go introduce myself to Maria. Bill chuckled, finishing his beer. You're a charmer, he said, standing up. I'm heading home while I still can. Have a good evening. Talk soon. Bill left the bar, and Roland turned back to Maria. Merry Christmas to me, he said to no one in particular, motioning for her to join him at the table. Yes, he decided, it would be a Merry Christmas with her in his bed.